It seems to me that 9/11, it has been in the planning for decades before it happened, and it is meant as a centerpiece, almost as a lightning rod, to encourage people to question things like this, to question, what do you really think you know? You've got a TV screen showing a plane going into a building, physically impossible the way that it's depicted, and just silly, really. When you look at the footage, it's silly. They weren't even really trying to make it look realistic. And yet everyone around you believes that planes went into the buildings that day. So, therefore, it stands to reason that you can infer from this that the people around you are not really paying that much attention. So what else are they missing? What else are you missing? Are you willing to go back to the start and reconsider things? And so in the case of ancient Egypt, we've got people saying that they think they know what was happening in that part of the world 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, and they think they know what the ancient Egyptian mythology was. Well, maybe you do, but have you checked the sources? If you take the time to check the sources for some of these stories, you'll find that a lot of them trace back to a thing called Oxyrhynchus, the Oxyrhynchus papyri that were discovered by Grenfell and Hunt.
The Oxyrhynchus papyri is a collection of papyri excavated from the rubbish dumps of the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus. This was done by two young Oxford scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century. The names are Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt. And then after an agreement with the local antiquity service, brought the papyri to England, actually deposited them at Oxford, where they have been ever since. So the Oxyrhynchus papyri project goes back to the late 1960s, when the British Academy started funding for the cataloguing of the collection. The AHRB took over in 1999 and the AHRC since 2005. Down to the late 60s, only 30 volumes have been published. Just under 50 years, another 50 have appeared. Without this funding, this would not have been possible. The funding allows the employment of dedicated researchers who make sure that there's basically a volume out every year, and also vastly improves the quality of the product.
The Oxyrhynchus papyri is a sort of cover term for the contents of the rubbish dumps of the old city. When the excavators got there wasn't much left of the buildings, but there were this series of low mounds which turned out to be rubbish tips, and mixed up with the old sandals and bits of dead cabbage. There were a very large number of written items, bits of books, bits of documents, and the Oxyrhynchus papyri covers all of those.
But they only discovered this stuff 120, 130 years ago. So how much of what we think is 2,000 or 3,000 year old myths are really things that were created out of thin air, or potentially created out of thin air 120, 130 years ago? And then as you start to get your head around some of these things, it makes more sense to come back to 9/11 and ask, well, the people behind that, are they the same people who are behind the fake history? Because if they are, that would kind of make sense. And then you look at Aleister Crowley and his Book of Thoth, and the fact that he supposedly wrote the Book of the Law in Egypt. You know, he supposedly wrote it while he was in a temple. And then you look at your $1 bill and you've got your little all-seeing eye, your little eye of providence above your pyramids. And when you start to tie some of these ideas together, for me anyhow, it's been a case of imagining that ancient Egypt was thousands of years ago and we knew what was happening, and that here we are today, and, you know, who's behind 9/11 we don't really know. I'm now starting to think maybe it's the same group of people. Maybe the same group of people created the myth of ancient Egypt. They created the myth of the pharaohs and the Sphinx and all this kind of stuff. And they're also the ones who are encouraging us to revisit the myth with these major events like 9/11. Mezzi, I know I'm being very convoluted when I explain it that way, but can you kind of get where I'm going with all of that?
Yeah, I do. And the other thing, I've been watching some interesting old movies of late with back in the English times of poverty and, you know, only the very rich and only the very poor. And I thought to myself, well, how do we know that? How do we actually know that there was that much poverty and people were, you know, this is the Dark Ages or something? And I just went, no, I'm just not going to believe that. This is just, again, another movie made for television to make us think that we're doing so good today compared to all those years ago when people died really, in their 30s and all that sort of stuff. I just refuse to take that as the way the movies go with all the poverty and all the rich people doing all the nefarious stuff and to the poor poverty people. Sorry, do you get where I'm coming with that?
Yeah, they show us, or they get us to imagine that in the past people were impoverished. And so thanks to technology or to government or thanks to mass education, we're so lucky now people are no longer impoverished. But they used to be.
Yeah.
So we're very lucky to have what we have today. And this is all premised on the idea that we know what was happening hundreds or thousands of years ago and that we're better off than how things were. And we know how they were because of history. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is maybe that's a lie as well. Maybe we don't really know the past, and maybe whatever was happening in the past, it wasn't necessarily all of these impoverished people. And maybe we're not actually so much better off than they were in the past.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and so who is giving us this ancient history? And in the case of ancient Egypt, and again, guys, I hope I'm wrong. Please, someone, check the primary sources, come back to me with some evidence that this is not all make-believe, but my research suggests that a lot of what we think we know about ancient Egypt goes back to Grenfell and Hunt and the Oxyrhynchus papyri. And the official story of the Oxyrhynchus papyri is that it's an ancient tip or a burial ground or a disposal facility or something like this. And these are where all these ancient texts were found that have been getting translated now over the past 100 or 120 years, or whatever the case might be. And it's from these texts that we derive our knowledge of ancient Egypt.
So this is one of the original tin boxes that came from Egypt, full of papyri. This is the way the papyri look like when they're picked from the ground. A massive small fragments that look like cornflakes. And if I pick up one here, I can see the beginnings of two lines with Greek names. These are all now in a line for touristic conservation, which will allow us to see what they actually say.
You can rebuild the papyrus from its fragments, but you also rebuild Oxyrhynchus from its papyri. The other side is the detective side, where here is this piece of brown stuff with writing on. What is it? And when you find out what it is, what does it say? When you find out what does it say, you think, how does it relate to other things? And of course, different things strike different notes in you. In one way, I'm always glad to find a piece of Greek poetry, because that's a thing of beauty. In another way, I always like to find a private letter, because for a moment you get a kind of snapshot of someone's real life.
With the papyri, there's always something new to say. Something that will keep you excited, something that will never allow you to be bored.
But of course, when you're sitting in your grade 3 or grade 4 class learning about the pyramids, or you're sitting in your university history class learning about the ancient historians, you're probably not being told in direct terms, oh, by the way, all the stories we're telling you come to us from 120 years ago discovery by dudes from Oxford University or from Cambridge University who claim to have discovered mountains of 1,000-year-old documents. Okay, that part isn't necessarily explained at the outset. You've got to dig to find that. And then when you find out that so much of what you think you know about ancient Egypt comes from this single questionable source, you can't help but wonder if maybe this is all part of a broader thing that's taking place, this creation of myths today. So we think that the ancient Egyptians had myths, but in fact, ancient Egypt is our myth today. If you get where I'm going with that, Missy, it's like, oh, we're so much smarter than the ancient Egyptians who believed that sun was God, and they used to walk around, making funny dance poses, and they used to worship their king and get on their knees and bow to the king who they thought was, God's incarnation on earth. And they built these pyramids, and they were either slaves or they worked for beer and bread, or who knows what the story is now. And we have all these ideas of the past, but actually all of those ideas are mythology. This is our mythology today, that there even was an ancient Egypt to begin with.
Yes, well, literally rubbish, isn't it? They found it in a rubbish tip.
Well,
I can't believe
I'm
it
gonna
survived
double check that.
thousands of years.
Hold on a second. I'm going to double check that because you're right. It is.
I remember-
Their story is literally rubbish. If my memory of this is correct, so let me double check this. This is Oxyrhynchus papyri from Wikipedia. The Oxyrhynchus papyri are a group of manuscripts discovered during the late 19th and early 20th centuries by papyrologists Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt at an ancient rubbish dump near Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. The manuscripts date from the time of Ptolemaic, 3rd century BC, and Roman periods of Egyptian history, 32 BC to the Arab conquest of Egypt, 640 AD. Although most of the papyri were written in Greek, some were written in Egyptian, Latin and Arabic. Since 1898, academics have puzzled together and transcribed over 5,000 documents from what were originally hundreds of boxes of papyrus fragments the size of large cornflakes. This is from Wikipedia, okay? Let me reread that passage from Wikipedia. Since 1898, academics have puzzled together and transcribed over 5,000 documents from what were originally hundreds of boxes of papyrus fragments the size of large cornflakes. Mezzy, this is the official story.
Unbelievable. That's unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, come on, you just gotta. That's a true story.
This is the official story. Now, people who haven't looked into this prior to hearing me talk about it would have every right to say, well, hold on, JLB. Who's to say that the Oxyrhynchus papyri is so important? They must have other sources. They must, that not all of what we think we know about ancient Egypt comes from Oxyrhynchus. You're ignoring the other sources. And to these people, I would say, great. Please go and find me the other sources. You find me the primary sources that any historian claims to have about ancient Egypt, and I will inspect them. But when I start checking through stories about ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, repeatedly the sources trace back to the Oxyrhynchus papyri. It hasn't happened to me once or twice. Constantly I find myself coming back to the Oxyrhynchus papyri, which, as Mezzy has correctly identified, is literally a load of rubbish.
The Oxyrhynchus papyri is a collection of papyri excavated from the rubbish dumps of the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus. This was done by two young Oxford scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century. The names are Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt. And then after an agreement with local antiquity service, brought the papyri to England, actually deposited them at Oxford, where they have been ever since. Excavated from the rubbish dumps of the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus. Excavated from the rubbish dumps of the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus.
Yeah, I wonder how many other rubbish tips they had around.
Yeah, and so.
I mean, come on, how many thousands of years later? It's just, oh God, it's just stupid.
Yeah, and look, people might listen to this. This might be the first member Skype call they've heard, and they might be thinking, hold on, I'm not understanding all of the tie-in here. Okay, so the Oxyrhynchus papyri were discovered in the 1890s. Okay, 1890s. People like Aleister Crowley come along, and they write. He writes his Book of the Law, supposedly in one of these ancient Egyptian tombs, in the early 1900s. So people like Crowley come along after the Oxyrhynchus papyri. So here we are today in 2018, and most of us were taught about ancient Egypt on television screens and at school, and the stories that we were given were about what supposedly happened thousands of years ago. What I'm suggesting is that much of what we think we know comes from 1890 and the Oxyrhynchus papyri, the rubbish dump. Then people like Aleister Crowley, or characters like Aleister Crowley, come along and they further popularise and mystify the ancient Egypt story by writing things like the Book of the Law, by saying that they wrote that book in a pyramid, by writing their own Book of Thoth, which is a tarot card which supposedly has connections to ancient Egyptian mysticism. Then fast forward to our present time today, and we've got people like the Sphinx guys doing some really cool work, making connections between the monolith, Stanley Kubrick, 9/11, Truman in the Truman Show, the number 17, all these kinds of things, really cool stuff. But they too are getting sucked into these stories of ancient Egypt as though those stories are real. However, if we take the time to check through the sources, maybe ancient Egypt is a myth that dates to the 1800s, and a lot of it to the 1890s through the Oxyrhynchus papyri. Do you think I've done a fair job there, Mizzy, at 1:30 on a Sunday afternoon, trying to tie?
I think you've done a great job there. But what about the pyramids, John? They've been there for 2,000 years, haven't they? Or 10,000 years, or 20,000 years?
Oh, maybe 80,000 years, Mizzy. If you read the Reddit conspiracy subreddit, which I do still read regularly, and there's not really many places online to discuss what we would call conspiracies. You've got forums like Godlike Productions and Above Top Secret. You've got Reddits like the subreddit Conspiracy. These places attract a large bulk of the traffic of discussion of these topics, and so I do still check, particularly the Reddit subreddit Conspiracy from time to time. And you will find, I'm very confident in saying this, you will find on that subreddit far more people, Mezzy, who believe that ancient history goes back further than they're telling us. They're hiding what was happening 100,000 years ago from us. The pyramids go back, tens of thousands of years. You'll find more conspiracy people, more act people with that mindset. Then you will find people who will open their minds to the possibility that it's not just the ancient Egyptians who had mythology, but we ourselves today have mythology, and one of those myths is ancient Egypt.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I've seen some of those people that say that the pyramids were built at a time when the stars were blah, 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 that was facing this way and that was facing that way. And as a matter of fact, pyramids were built according to the stars in the sky, and the Milky Way was the Nile River, et cetera, et cetera. But, again, they're only just guessing. And what I don't get is, how do they actually know what the stars did 10,000 years ago? Really?
Yeah, exactly. How would we know?
Yeah.
Most of us don't even know what the stars are doing today.
I know. A myth on top of a myth on top of a myth.
Excavated from the rubbish dumps of the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus. Excavated from the rubbish dumps of the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus. Excavated from the rubbish dumps of the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus.